Okay, gentlemen, as we mentioned yesterday, China is not going to take this lying down. We have reached the genuine beginning of decoupling. This marks the beginning of the economic apocalypse. And let us get you up to speed. Trump has put an extra 10% tax on Chinese products entering the United States. That's on top of the extraordinarily high tariffs imposed during the first trade war and Biden's sanctions. So EV taxes are now 110%, solar cells are 60%, and Chinese steel is taxed at 35%. Today, the US essentially wants to terminate trade with China, harming their export economy. Beijing will have none of it. We have often stated that China cannot afford to let Trump steamroll the country. It's not only an issue of pride here, it's also about economic survival and demonstrating power to the global south and the BRICS. You cannot be a global power if you are attacked and do not respond. China has formally reacted against President Trump's trade battle. The apprentice star has been involved in a BRICS war. China's Mr. Big is not going to back down from this one. China has changed dramatically in the last 10 or 5 years. China's economy is strong, supported by low-cost Russian goods. They control crucial supply networks and trade with the vast majority of the world's countries. There is a reason why Trump first slapped a 25% tax on Canada and Mexico. Since they are vulnerable due to their reliance on the US consumer market, it's not a particularly complicated problem. However, China is much different to decades ago. The US contributed for 21% of China's total exports. However, since Trump's first trade battle in 2018, Beijing has taken that warning extremely seriously. They actively diversified their commerce. They began dealing more with Russia, Asia, and Latin America. Last year, China's exports to the United States totaled barely 15%. But here's the crucial bit. Trump and France are unable to decrease their Chinese imports to zero. It just cannot happen, because if it does, the US economy will collapse quickly. Every single American will bear the price. Walmart alone sells 80% of its items from Chinese sources, while fewer than 20% come from American businesses. This is what happens when firms pursue profits indefinitely. Trump's 10% tariffs will be passed on to us consumers, and if he accelerates at a 60% pace, household budgets in the United States would collapse. China understands this as well, and they have significant influence. Remember what Trump promised the voting base: lower inflation. But if there is another cost of living catastrophe, his support will begin to wane. It's critical to understand why China needs to respond. The underlying mentality in Washington toward China is full-fledged containment. Just listen to Rubio's take on China, and it's clear that there's no going back. He's imposed additional tariffs. We already had tariffs on China. These are additional tariffs. Can China expect more, do you think, on top of what he's already proposed? Well, if they continue to cheat in steel, yeah, absolutely. Look, China's doing what China is doing in their national interest. I frankly don't like it, but I don't blame what the Chinese leaders are doing. They're doing what any leader of a country would do. If you let them take advantage of you, they will. So I think he wants to bring fairness back to that relationship. And obviously, China is going to be upset that we try to bring fairness because they've had a really good deal, an unfair deal, for a long time. The president is going to make that equal, and look, that's going to create outrage in Washington and in editorial boardrooms. But millions of people, whether they're watching this broadcaster, are living in real-world America, say, of course, this all makes sense. All of it makes sense to them. If you're sitting in Beijing, you know the US will keep pushing their luck. Biden's semiconductor limits are only the appetizer. Donald Trump is now serving the main course. China's approach of not fighting back and simply giving up is a losing one. Trump will continue to press and demand more concessions from them. They have now put a 15% retaliatory tax on US coal and LNG, effectively cutting off energy exports. It is unsurprising that China is taking the initial step. Beijing is benefiting significantly from Russian energy sanctions. They have an unlimited supply of inexpensive Russian gas and LNG on hand. In addition, China's trade relations with Australia are improving and remain strong, and that's where they get the majority of their energy supply. 34% of the overall Supply comes from Australia, 23% from Qatar, and over 10% from Russia. US LNG is just about 5 to 6%, so it's no stress off. China's back, however, it would have an influence on the United States economy. The Chinese economy is the world's largest energy importer, so this 6% remains extremely big. Now, imposing a levy on their US energy supply is effectively a cut-off. Chinese traders would exchange their American goods for alternatives, and with Chinese demand gone, Trump would have to pressure his largest consumer to acquire even more LNG. As a result, the EU would suffer the most. China's tariffs essentially confirm Trump's intention to persuade Europe to buy even more. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, this is a bad decision. It moves the EU closer to economic collapse while further fracturing the G7 coalition. These are the second-order consequences of China's counterattack. Now, Trump has stated his desire to increase US LNG exports. However, if Chinese demand declines, projects will become increasingly difficult to finance in the short to medium term. China is expected to make up the shortage with Russian gas. Aside from LNG, China has put a 10% levy on US agricultural equipment. This isn't a large number by any means, but it does show that US agriculture is on the radar and it's on the chopping board. This 10% tariff is also an effort by Beijing to become more self-sufficient. We'll have more home industries that'll swoop in and supply this need quickly. As China grows more food, we may expect them to divorce off US exports. In the first quarter of 2024, China cancelled about 500,000 tons of wheat imports from the United States, the biggest level in decades. Even before the tariff conflict, China was becoming increasingly reliant on local food supplies. Alternatively, they could always import cheaper crops from Brazil. This is not good news for US farmers. Profits are starting to fall, and decreasing grain demand from China will compress their margins even further. This is the weak point of the US export economy. In 2022, net agricultural income was $182 billion. However, by 2024, this figure will have dropped to $140 billion, a staggering 23% decrease. Farmers are paying more and earning less as inflation rises, wages rise, and equipment becomes more expensive. A trade war with China is clearly a bad idea, and based on many of the stories in mainstream media, it appears like China's reprisal is neither significant nor sufficient. Either Beijing is restricting itself or is scared of Trump. On the surface, this appears to be true. China's tariffs only targeted $14 billion in US imports, but the US punished more than $500 billion or $500 billion in Chinese exports. But we must not overlook the mechanics of tariffs. Let's ask a fifth grader. Who paid for tariffs? It's the American customers themselves. The loss is borne by US corporations who import the items, as well as by customers who pay at the counter. The corporations will pass on the additional cost to them. China not matching the US also helps to keep Chinese consumers from experiencing an inflation shock. For the time being, they have the strength to resist the temptation. Furthermore, by starting with a low bar, China has room to increase the agony. Over the next months and years, Beijing will be able to target substantially more US goods. They have around $160 billion to strike back against, so China isn't exactly in a rush here. They're presumably looking for alternate suppliers for the remaining items on the list. Decoupling is only getting begun. If Trump catches the signal, the wisest action right now is to retreat and cancel the 10% tariff. De-escalate immediately, before it is too late. Let us consider the possibility of a full-fledged Chinese reaction. Their economy is growing self-sufficient, and Beijing is preparing to unleash a torrent of stimulus throughout China's supply chain. Enterprises and individuals will step in to fill holes. Donald Trump should not be concerned by China's initial tariff rate. He should be frightened of being completely replaced. These are the top US exports to China: soybeans, electronics, crude oil, airplane components, automobiles, and corn. Is there a common theme here? All of these are imports that China is actively attempting to replace. either through alternative sources or by manufacturing locally, like the semiconductor bans. This will drive China to make a patriotic push for self-sufficiency. However, it will be worse because it is now widespread rather than limited to chips. So, how awful is this for the United States? Let's start with a high-level picture. What are the macroeconomic implications for Trump's economy? A 10% tax on China would reduce the US GDP by $55 billion, assuming China retaliates with equal severity, which it hasn't yet. So, if you live in the United States, you may breathe easy for now. The discomfort is really little. But what have we witnessed in the past 3 years? It's one escalation after another, so we have to brace ourselves for hits. Even if China withdraws its tariffs tomorrow, the situation would not be resolved. They can just discontinue supplies entirely next month or next year. This figure illustrates how much US employment is supported by the top exports to China. How? Many jobs are supporting 18.5 billion in goods. Agriculture is the sector with the most exposure. There are about 180,000 jobs in oilseeds and RS alone. If Chinese students leave the US, education and employment will suffer. 120,000 of them cutting out equipment, semiconductors, vehicles, and energy would result in the loss of another 100,000 jobs. So, there is collateral harm. It is hard for the US to swiftly replace Chinese demand, especially given that they will eventually overtake the US as the largest customer. Let's go mini immediately. Which states in the United States will be the hardest hit? Not all states will suffer. New York, for example, is excellent because Wall Street dominates the city. Others, however, will be wounded more severely. And here are the states with the most victims: Texas, California, Louisiana, Indiana, and Illinois. These are the states that export the most to China. If we see full tariff retaliation or a complete shutdown, employment losses will be focused here. This is the impact of a tariff war. Sure, Washington is making the decisions, but the entire country will bear the consequences. The trade battle must end, or significant layoffs will occur sooner or later. However, China's response is not limited to exports, and this is where Trump's imagination fails. When you undertake economic war, it has several dimensions. The debt market is the most serious weakness in the US economy. Congress just cannot stop spending, putting them in a difficult position. Major institutions have previously stated that US bond rates are very low when compared to inflation risk and fiscal balance. What would a trade battle with China cost? It drives up inflation across the board, particularly in consumer items. If conditions worsen, the 10-year yield might rise beyond 5%. It might potentially recover to 6%. Remember that this is independent of the Fed's rate reduction. So how does China fit into this? They have roughly $800 billion in US bonds. Beijing has two options: deleverage and walk away for good, or aggressively dump. Will other nations step in to save the US? At this moment, we don't know. Following Trump's tariff shock, nations will be leery of retaining US debt, especially since they may trade significantly less with the US in the near future. And I think this provides a comprehensive picture of China's reaction. What we're witnessing is only the top of the iceberg. Once again, we must remind ourselves that quiet does not imply compliance. This is simply a warning shot for the US economy. It's simply a taste of what's to come. But as usual, please let me know your thoughts. What else does China have in store for the United States? Will they cut away all US imports in the years to come? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, and be sure to smash that like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.